October 20th, 1967, the Six Rivers National Forest, Northern California. Roger Patterson has approximately 40 yards between him and whatever he is running toward. His horse is down behind him. The camera is in his hand. His legs are moving before his mind has fully processed what his eyes are telling him. He has been looking for this his entire adult life, and now it is here. He films for 59 seconds. What happens in those 59 seconds has not been resolved in the 57 years since. Not by Hollywood studios, not by primate biologists, not by forensic specialists or biomechanics researchers or digital analysts with equipment that Patterson could not have imagined in 1967, not by the dozens of individuals who have claimed over the decades to know the truth about what was filmed that afternoon at Bluff Creek. The film exists. The figure in it walks. At one point, it turns and looks at the camera. Everything else is still open. This is the story of those 59 seconds and of what it means that 57 years have not been enough to close it. Roger Patterson was born in 1926 in Wash, a small community in Washington State. He grew up in the inland Pacific Northwest, in the forests and ranch country of a region where stories about large, man-like creatures in the wilderness were not uncommon. They were part of the landscape in a way that people who did not grow up there sometimes find difficult to understand. Not believed by everyone, not dismissed by everyone, simply present. One of the things that might be out there, alongside the bears and the cougars and the elk, Patterson became a rodeo rider. He was, by most accounts, a man of considerable physical courage and limited financial stability, someone who pursued what interested him with a commitment that was not always matched by practical caution. In the early 1960s, he became seriously interested in what was then being called Bigfoot, a word that had entered the public vocabulary following the 1958 newspaper coverage of large tracks found near a logging road in Humboldt County, California. He read everything available on the subject. He interviewed witnesses. He traveled to locations where sightings had been reported. He began carrying a camera. He made a short documentary film about the subject that was rough and enthusiastic and not entirely successful. And he kept going back to Bluff Creek. Bluff Creek is a drainage in the Six Rivers National Forest, a remote area of old-growth and second-growth timber in the northwestern corner of California near the Oregon border. It had been a center of Bigfoot activity reports since the late 1950s. Tracks had been found there repeatedly. Workers on road construction projects had reported unusual events. The area had a history. Patterson believed that if he spent enough time in the right places, he would eventually encounter what he was looking for. In October of 1967, he arranged a horseback expedition into the Bluff Creek drainage with his friend Bob Gimlin. Gimlin was a more cautious personality than Patterson, skeptical where Patterson was credulous, methodical where Patterson was impulsive, carrying a rifle as a practical measure where Patterson carried a camera as a statement of intent. They rode in on October 20th. At approximately 1:15 in the afternoon, the horses reacted. The physical description of what Patterson filmed has been analyzed so many times in so many contexts by so many different specialists that it can feel like familiar territory. It is not. The details reward careful attention every time. The figure is large. Estimates of its height at the time of filming range from 6 feet 2 inches to 7 feet 6 inches, depending on the methodology used and the assumptions built into it. The variation in those estimates reflects genuine uncertainty about the reference points available in the film, not disagreement about the figure itself. What is not in dispute is that the figure is substantially larger than an average adult human male. Its arms are long, disproportionately long. In the frames where it is walking away from the camera, the hands of the figure are visible well below the hip joint, reaching toward the knee in a way that is inconsistent with human arm-to-torso proportions and consistent with the upper limb proportions of large apes. This detail has been measured repeatedly using photogrammetric analysis. The arm length is anomalous by human standards regardless of the height estimate used. Its gait is unusual in ways that biomechanics researchers have found difficult to account for within known human or primate motion parameters. Dr. D.W. Grieve, a reader in biomechanics at the Royal Free Hospital School of Medicine in London, analyzed the Patterson film in the early 1970s and produced a measured, careful report that is still among the most cited analyses of the footage. Grieve noted that the gait pattern shown in the film, specifically the degree of knee flexion during the stance phase of the stride, combined with the forward lean of the torso, would be extremely difficult for a human being to sustain for more than a few steps. The metabolic cost would be prohibitive. The joint angles required would be uncomfortable to the point of injury for a human walking normally. He noted that this gait pattern would be consistent with an animal of substantially different lower limb proportions than humans possess. An animal with a longer femur relative to tibia, with different hip and knee joint geometry, could walk this way naturally and efficiently. He concluded that either the film showed an unknown animal or it showed a human being walking in a way that would require considerable athletic training to sustain for even short distances. He did not conclude it was a hoax. He concluded it was genuinely anomalous. The hoax argument has taken several forms over the decades. The most persistent is the suit argument, that the figure in the film is a human being wearing a specially constructed costume. This argument requires a costume maker of extraordinary skill, working in 1967 with the technology available in 1967, who produced a suit that has never been identified, claimed, produced, or replicated despite 60 years of motivated searching. The costume design and effects industry of 1967 is well documented. The major studios and their contractors are known. The independent costume makers working in that era are known. Researchers have contacted virtually all of them. None made a Bigfoot suit for Roger Patterson. None claim to have made one. None have produced evidence that such a suit was made. The most credible hoax claimant was a man named Bob Hieronymus, who came forward in 2004 claiming to have been the person in the suit. Hieronymus said he was paid $200 by Patterson to wear the costume and walk across the creek bed at Bluff Creek. His account contained several problems that investigators documented carefully. He was unable to identify the suit maker. He said a man named Philip Morris made the suit, but Morris denied it, and Hieronymus was unable to produce any physical evidence connecting Morris to the suit. He was unable to replicate the gait shown in the film. When he walked for cameras, his gait pattern was recognizably human and recognizably different from the figure in the Patterson footage. He was unable to describe the suit in physical detail consistent with what the film shows. The muscle movement visible in the film, the play of large muscle groups across the back and thighs, cannot be produced by a suit worn over a human body without mechanisms that did not exist in 1967. His account also conflicted in several details with the account given by Bob Gimlin, who was present at the filming and who has maintained consistently for over 50 years that what they filmed was not a man in a suit. Gimlin is a more credible figure than Patterson in some respects. He was skeptical going in. He did not write books about Bigfoot or go on speaking tours. He did not profit from the encounter in any significant way. He has given consistent, careful accounts of what happened for over 50 years. Accounts that do not contain the internal contradictions that typically accumulate in fabricated testimony over long periods. He says they filmed a real animal. He says it clearly. He has said it for 50 years. The hoax argument has never been able to account for Gimlin's testimony in any way that is not more complicated than the alternative. The most scientifically significant analysis of the Patterson-Gimlin film was not a visual analysis. It was a biomechanical analysis conducted by a Russian researcher named Dr. Dmitri Donskoy, chief of the biomechanics department at the Central Institute of Physical Culture in Moscow in the 1970s. Donskoy's analysis was thorough and methodologically rigorous. He examined the movement of every major body part visible in the film across multiple frames, calculated the center of mass distribution and its movement through the stride cycle, and compared the results to the extensive biomechanical data available for human walking and running gaits. His conclusions were specific. The motion patterns in the film are not consistent with human locomotion. The distribution of mass, the movement of the hip joint, the relationship between upper and lower body movement during the stride. These are organized differently than they are in any human gait pattern. They are organized differently in ways that reflect different underlying anatomy, not different technique applied to human anatomy. Different anatomy. He did not conclude it was an unknown species. He concluded it was not a human being wearing a costume. The motion profile was wrong for that explanation. What was it then? Donskoy did not answer that question. He answered the question he could answer, the question of what it wasn't. What it wasn't was a man in a suit. In 1971, the physical anthropologist Grover Krantz at Washington State University began what would become a decades-long study of the physical evidence for Bigfoot. Krantz was unusual among academic researchers in being willing to engage with this subject publicly and to publish his conclusions regardless of the professional cost. The professional cost was real. He was passed over for promotions. His research was not funded through normal academic channels. He was treated by many colleagues as someone who had made a serious professional error from which he was unlikely to recover. He continued anyway. Krantz's contributions to the physical evidence analysis are substantial. His work on foot anatomy, specifically on the anatomical features visible in track casts from various locations, established several points that have not been effectively refuted. First, that the tracks show a mid-tarsal pressure ridge not present in human footprints. This ridge results from a specific kind of foot flexibility, a mid-tarsal break, that is different from human foot anatomy, and that would produce a distinctive pressure pattern in soft ground. The pattern appears in casts from locations across the continent, collected by independent researchers with no coordination between them. Second, that the size and depth of the tracks taken together with the stride length and the pressure distribution require an animal of substantial mass walking bipedally. Krantz calculated that the tracks were consistent with an animal weighing between 600 and 900 pounds. No known primate other than large gorillas approaches this mass range, and gorillas are not bipedal walkers. Third, that the foot structure implied by the tracks is not simply a large human foot. It has different proportions, different toe placement, and the mid-tarsal break that human feet do not have. It is a different kind of foot, a foot that would belong to a different kind of animal. Krantz spent 30 years developing these analyses. When he died in 2002, he donated his skeleton to the Smithsonian Institution and asked that it be stored alongside the skeleton of his dog, which he had also donated. He was, by all accounts, a man who followed the evidence where it led and was willing to accept the professional consequences. His work remains among the most careful and methodologically sound in the physical evidence literature. The dermal ridge evidence deserves special attention because it represents a category of physical documentation that is very difficult to explain through conventional hoax mechanisms. Dermal ridges are the friction skin patterns on the bottom of the foot, the equivalent of fingerprints. They are unique to individual animals. They cannot be convincingly faked with foam rubber or carved wood. When present in track casts, they represent evidence that an actual biological foot made the track, a foot with the complex microstructure of real skin. Jimmy Chilcutt, a fingerprint examiner with the Conroe, Texas Police Department, developed expertise in primate dermatoglyphics, the study of dermal ridge patterns across species, and apply that expertise to a collection of track casts from various Bigfoot locations. He approached the analysis as a debunking exercise. He expected to find either human ridge patterns or no ridges at all. What he found was different. The ridge patterns in the casts he examined were consistent across casts from different locations and different decades. They showed individual variation, different animals, different tracks, but within a consistent pattern type. That pattern type was not human. It was not consistent with any known great ape. It had characteristics, ridge flow direction, ridge width, pattern geometry, that were distinct from the documented range of primate dermatoglyphics. Chilcutt's conclusion was careful. He said the casts were made by a primate not represented in the scientific literature, not a hoax, not human, not any known species. He did not say Bigfoot. He said unknown primate. He said this as a forensic specialist with no stake in the outcome, no prior interest in the subject, and no apparent reason to misrepresent his findings. His analysis has been disputed. It has not been refuted. The question of why, if the Patterson-Gimlin film shows a real animal, that animal has not been found in the decades since, is the question that the film's defenders have the most difficulty answering. The absence of a specimen, the absence of bones, the absence of a body ever found in the wilderness that could not be attributed to a known species, the absence of a living animal in captivity. These absences are real and they require explanation. Several explanations have been offered. Population density. If the species exists in small numbers across an enormous range, the probability of a natural death occurring in a location accessible to human discovery is low. Large areas of North America remain genuinely remote, the kind of remote where a large animal could live and die without ever intersecting the locations humans travel through. Behavior. An animal that is actively avoiding human contact, that has been successfully avoiding it for a very long time, might have behavioral adaptations that extend to the disposal or concealment of the dead. This is not without precedent. Some primates show behavior around the dead that goes beyond simple abandonment. And then there is the framework that the multi-phenomena researchers have offered, the possibility that whatever this is does not relate to physical reality the way ordinary animals do, that it does not leave a body because it does not have a body in the sense that would produce forensic evidence, that the absence of physical remains is not a mystery, but a feature. The same feature that produces the tracks that stop in the middle of open ground. This explanation is not satisfying to biology, but it is consistent with the totality of the evidence in a way that the purely biological explanation is not. Something was filmed at Bluff Creek in 1967. It moved in ways that no human being can sustain. It left tracks that contained dermal ridges inconsistent with any known species. It turned and looked at the camera with an awareness that does not suggest an animal in a state of simple flight. And then it walked into the trees and has not definitively been found since. There is a version of the Bluff Creek story that almost never gets told because it requires sitting with ambiguity in a way that neither the believers nor the skeptics find comfortable. It goes like this. Something real was filmed. The evidence for the film's authenticity is more robust than the evidence for its fabrication. The physical evidence at the site was genuine. The witness testimony from both Patterson and Gimlin has been consistent for over 50 years, and we still do not know what it was. Not because the investigation has been inadequate, not because the technology has been insufficient, not because the right people haven't looked, but because whatever was filmed that afternoon does not want to be found, has never wanted to be found, has been exercising for 57 years, the same capacity it exercised when it turned and looked at the camera, the capacity to decide what relationship it has with the humans who are paying attention to it. It allowed itself to be filmed. 59 seconds. One clear, close, unambiguous film sequence that has never been definitively disproven. And then it was done. It decided the encounter was over. It walked into the trees. It left tracks that stop. And in the 57 years since, despite everything that has been brought to bear on finding it, every camera, every monitoring station, every research expedition, every motivated and well-funded debunking effort, it has maintained exactly the relationship to human observation that it chose on that October afternoon in 1967. Visible when it chooses to be, gone when it's done. The film is 59 seconds long. In 57 years, nothing has been added to it. Think about what that means. There are researchers who have spent their careers on this film, people who have watched those 59 seconds thousands of times, who have analyzed every frame, measured every proportion, mapped every movement. Some of them have concluded it is a hoax. Some have concluded it is real. Most of the serious ones, the ones who have spent the most time with the evidence and who have the deepest expertise, land somewhere more complicated than either of those positions. They land in the place that the evidence actually occupies, which is genuinely anomalous, not fake, not proven authentic. Anomalous, resistant to the standard explanations in both directions. That is an uncomfortable place to occupy. Our culture wants resolution. It wants the verdict, the confirmation, the closure. It wants to know whether to believe or to dismiss. The film does not offer that. It never has. It sits in the category of things that are real enough to take seriously and strange enough to resist definitive explanation. That category is larger than most people are comfortable acknowledging. It contains the film. It contains the tracks. It contains the testimony of thousands of witnesses across centuries. It contains whatever is in those forests. Whatever walked into that creek bed on October 20th, 1967, and turned to look at the camera before disappearing into the trees. It is still out there. The trees are still there. The creek is still there. The forest is still the forest it has always been. And whatever lives in it is still, tonight, exactly as present and exactly as unknowable as it was on the afternoon Roger Patterson fell off his horse and ran. 59 seconds of film. 57 years of questions. The questions are still open. The forest is still quiet. What has never been adequately addressed in the mainstream discussion of the Patterson-Gimlin film is the question of what Patterson and Gimlin felt in the immediate aftermath of the encounter. Not what they reported to investigators. Not the official account given to journalists. what they felt. Gimlin, in interviews given decades after the event, has described the experience with a specificity that suggests genuine memory rather than constructed narrative. He remembers the smell. He remembers the sound of the horses. He remembers the way the light was falling on the creek bed. He remembers the quality of the silence that followed when the figure disappeared into the trees. He describes standing at the site afterward, looking at the tracks, and experiencing something he has difficulty naming. Not excitement, not triumph, something heavier. A sense of having been in the presence of something that placed him in a different relationship to the wilderness than the one he had brought with him into the forest that morning. He has said that he never quite felt the same about being in the woods after that day. Not in a frightened way, in a changed way, as if the forest had revealed something about itself that could not be unrevealed. This description, the forest revealing something, the person changed by the revelation, appears in encounter testimony with a consistency that is itself a form of data. The Tsimshian tradition described it as being seen by something that exists outside the normal boundaries of human experience and being changed by that seeing. The Cherokee tradition encoded the weight of close encounter in the protocols surrounding how you spoke about it afterward. The Lakota elder described the sense of having been assessed by something very old. Gimlin's description of standing at the Bluff Creek site, looking at those tracks, feeling the forest differently than he ever had before. This is the same description, in the language of a mid-20th century American rancher rather than a traditional indigenous framework. But the same. He was seen, and he knew it. The digital era has brought new analytical tools to the Patterson-Gimlin footage and has produced results that cut in both directions. On one hand, enhancement and stabilization technology has allowed researchers to examine frames of the film in detail not possible in earlier decades. What these enhanced frames show is, if anything, more compelling than the original prints. The muscle movement visible in the figure's back and thighs, the play of large muscle groups beneath the surface, is more apparent in high-resolution enhancement than in the original footage. The proportional anomalies are more measurable. The gait pattern is more clearly distinct from human locomotion. On the other hand, digital technology has also produced a generation of claimants who argue that specific frames, when analyzed in particular ways, reveal features consistent with a costume rather than a biological animal. These arguments have not achieved consensus even among skeptics. The features identified as costume artifacts are identified differently by different analysts. The methodology for distinguishing biological hair from artificial fiber in compressed 16mm footage is not agreed upon. What the digital era has not produced is a definitive case for hoax. This is significant. The same technology that was supposed to finally expose the film, to find the zipper, the seam, the telltale artifact that would end the debate, has instead produced 50 more years of disagreement. The film has outlasted every technology brought to bear on it. That is, at minimum, a remarkable fact about a piece of footage that was supposedly shot in an afternoon in 1967 by a cowboy with a 16mm camera and a man in a gorilla suit. There is one more witness whose account of the Bluff Creek encounter deserves attention and who is rarely discussed in the mainstream literature about the film. His name is Al Hodgson. He was the owner of a general store in the small town of Willow Creek, California, which served as the nearest supply point for expeditions into the Bluff Creek drainage. Patterson had visited his store multiple times before the October 1967 trip. Hodgson knew Patterson. He knew his background and his obsession with finding physical evidence of the creature. When Patterson came to him after the filming and showed him the footage, Hodgson described Patterson's demeanor as unlike anything he had seen from him before. Patterson was a man who, by all accounts, was prone to enthusiasm. He was expressive. He wanted to believe in what he was looking for, and that wanting sometimes showed in how he talked about it. When he came to Hodgson with the footage, the enthusiasm was gone. What was there instead was something quieter, something that Hodgson described in interviews years later as the demeanor of a man who had gotten what he wanted and found it more than he had bargained for. Patterson was not triumphant. He was, if anything, subdued. Hodgson said that what struck him was how carefully Patterson was moving, how deliberately he was handling the film, as if it were something that needed to be treated with a specific kind of care. He said Patterson told him, I got it on film." And then he was quiet for a moment. And then he said, "I don't think I understood what I was looking for until I found it." That statement, reported secondhand and decades later, cannot be verified. But it has the ring of something true. The ring of a person who spent years believing in something and then encountered the reality of it and found the reality different from the belief, more complex, more unsettling, more insistent on being taken seriously in a way that was not entirely comfortable. Patterson died in 1972 of Hodgkin's lymphoma. He was 49 years old. He had spent the years between the filming and his death working to have the footage taken seriously. He was not, by most accounts, successful in his lifetime. The scientific establishment did not embrace his film. The mainstream culture treated it as a curiosity, a famous piece of ambiguous footage, the thing at the beginning of every Bigfoot documentary. He died without resolution. The film he made in those 59 seconds is still the most examined, most contested, most unresolved piece of evidence in the entire history of this subject. It is also still unexplained. In 2020, a research team led by Bill Munns, a special effects artist with decades of experience in creature design for Hollywood productions, published a detailed analysis of the Patterson-Gimlin figure using techniques developed in the entertainment industry for analyzing and recreating body proportions and movement. Munns's conclusion was specific and detailed. He determined that the figure in the film has a shoulder width of approximately 54 to 57 inches, a shoulder height of approximately 87 inches, and a body mass estimated at between 700 and 800 pounds based on proportional analysis of the visible body structure. He then examined whether a human being could plausibly occupy the figure in the film. Could a person of any height, wearing a suit, produce the silhouette and the proportions visible in the footage? His conclusion was that no human being of any known height could fill the shoulder width of the figure while maintaining the height ratio were visible in the film. The shoulders are too wide and too high relative to the torso length for any human body proportion. A person with shoulders wide enough to match the figure would need to be physically impossible by human anatomical standards. A person of the right height would have shoulders too narrow to match by a margin that no padding could bridge without producing visible distortion. Munns is not a Bigfoot researcher. He is a special effects professional. His expertise is in making fake creatures look real. He knows from professional experience exactly what a person in a suit looks like and what the limits of costume design are. His conclusion was that the figure in the film cannot be explained as a person in a suit. This analysis has been challenged. It has not been refuted. The Patterson-Gimlin film turns 57 years old this year. It remains what it has always been. 59 seconds of film in which something walks across a creek bed, turns to look at the camera, and continues into the trees. 57 years. Every available analytical technology, dozens of credentialed specialists, enormous financial motivation on both sides to reach a definitive conclusion. and the conclusion is the same as it was on October 21st, 1967, the morning after it was filmed. Genuinely anomalous, resistant to explanation, present. There is a temptation, when confronted with something that resists explanation for this long, to conclude that it must eventually yield, that there must be an answer we have not yet found, that the right analysis, the right technology, the right witness coming forward with the right piece of information will finally resolve it. That temptation assumes that the thing being analyzed is the kind of thing that yields to this kind of pressure, the kind of thing that has a definitive explanation waiting to be found. What if it isn't? What if the 57 years of unresolved analysis is not a failure of the analysis, but a feature of the subject? What if the thing that walked into that creek bed and turned to look at the camera understood exactly what it was doing? What if the 59 seconds of footage are not an accident of observation, but a decision, a choice about exactly how much to reveal? This is not a comfortable possibility, but it is consistent with the evidence. It is consistent with 57 years of footage that has never yielded a definitive answer. It is consistent with tracks that stop in the middle of open ground. It is consistent with vocalizations that cannot be matched to any species. It is consistent with thousands of witness accounts that describe not a creature being observed, but a presence that is doing the observing. The indigenous traditions would not find any of this surprising. They have been saying it for 10,000 years. The being in the forest is not there to be found. It is there to find you. Whether you notice that distinction may be the most important thing about your relationship to whatever lives in those trees. The film is still there. The trees are still there. The creek is still running. And 57 years later, in some forest in the Pacific Northwest, on some evening when the light is going and the shadows are growing long, something that walks the way the figure in that film walks is making the same choice it made in October of 1967, deciding what to show, deciding what to withhold, deciding whether you are worth noticing. The camera ran out of film. What was filmed never ran out of anything. The location itself deserves examination. Bluff Creek did not become significant because Patterson filmed there. Patterson filmed there because Bluff Creek already had a history. The history begins, in the written record at least, in the late 1950s when a construction crew working on a new road into the Six Rivers National Forest began finding large, clearly bipedal tracks around their equipment at night. The crew foreman, a man named Ray Wallace, reported the tracks to a journalist. The journalist wrote a story. The word Bigfoot appeared in print for the first time. After Wallace's death in 2002, members of his family claimed that Wallace himself had faked the tracks using carved wooden feet. This claim was accepted with unusual speed by media outlets that had spent decades dismissing the subject. It seemed to provide the definitive debunking that had been missing. But the claim cannot account for the tracks found before Wallace arrived at the site. It cannot account for the tracks found at locations where Wallace had no documented presence. It cannot account for the physical evidence, including the dermal ridges that were analyzed decades later, that was collected at Bluff Creek independently by researchers who had no connection to Wallace. The Wallace family story, examined carefully, explains some tracks made by some people at some times. It does not explain the pattern that drew researchers to Bluff Creek in the first place. It does not explain what Patterson filmed. And it does not explain the accounts from people who were working in the Six Rivers drainage before the road project began, before Wallace arrived, before there was any public discussion of Bigfoot in the area, because those people were also finding tracks and also hearing things at night that they did not understand. And also, sometimes seeing something at the edge of the tree line that they were never able to identify and never entirely forgot. There is an account from the 1950s collected by an early researcher and published in a small circulation pamphlet that has since become extremely difficult to find, from a man who worked as a hunting guide in the Bluff Creek drainage for several seasons before the road construction began. He had been operating out of a base camp in the drainage for 3 seasons when he first found the tracks. He knew the area well. He had spent hundreds of nights there. He knew every animal that left tracks in that country, and he knew what those tracks looked like. These were not any of them. He followed the tracks for about a mile before they led him into terrain too steep to navigate safely. He turned back. He told no one at the time because he did not have language for what he had found and because he had a professional reputation to maintain. The following season, he heard something. It was late in the evening. The campfire burned down to coals, his clients asleep in their tents. He was sitting outside, as he habitually did, listening to the forest before sleep. The forest went quiet. He noted it specifically. It was the total absorptive silence that old-timers in the Pacific Northwest knew and that newcomers sometimes mistook for peace, but that people who had spent real time in those forests understood as something else. The silence that meant something was moving through the area, something that caused every other living thing to stop. Then, from the ridgeline above the camp, a sound. He described it as the longest, saddest thing he had ever heard in the forest. Not a coyote, not any bird, not any animal he had ever encountered in decades of working in that country. A sustained vocalization, rising and falling, that went on for what seemed like several minutes before it ended. When it ended, the forest stayed quiet for a long time. Then, gradually, the night sounds returned. Frogs, insects, the small movements of small animals. He lay in his tent until morning. He did not sleep. He never guiding in the Bluff Creek drainage again. He moved his operation to a different part of the forest and spent the rest of his career there. When he told the researcher about the experience, years later, he was in his late 70s and had never spoken about it publicly. He said, "I was a practical man my whole life. Still am. I don't believe in things I can't see. But I know what I heard that night. And whatever it was, it had no business making a sound that sat in your chest like that. No animal I ever heard made a sound like that." He paused. Then he said, "It sounded lonely, is the only way I can put it. It sounded like something that had been alone for a very long time." The physical geography of the Bluff Creek drainage has characteristics that appear repeatedly in high encounter zones across the continent. Researchers working in multiple disciplines have noted that areas with elevated encounter reports tend to share certain geological and geographic features. High elevation ridgelines adjacent to deep drainages, proximity to water, not just streams, but the convergence of multiple water sources, dense old growth or near old growth timber providing year-round cover, relative inaccessibility to casual human traffic combined with proximity to more frequently traveled areas. Bluff Creek has all of these. The drainage runs between steep ridgelines in country that is navigable by experienced wilderness travelers, but not by anyone who simply wanders in. The old-growth timber in the area provides cover that is qualitatively different from second growth. It is darker, quieter, structured differently, and produces a microclimate that is noticeably distinct from the surrounding logged areas. Several researchers have added another consideration that mainstream biology is not yet equipped to evaluate. The geological substrate of the Bluff Creek drainage, like several other high encounter zones, sits on a complex of granitic formations with high piezoelectric potential. rock formations that produce electrical fields under pressure, such as the pressure produced by tectonic stress or seismic activity. The relationship between piezoelectric geology and anomalous phenomena, including both UFO reports and creature encounters, has been noted by several independent researchers working from different methodological traditions. The Uinta Basin in Utah, site of Skinwalker Ranch, shares similar geological characteristics. So does the Olympic Peninsula. So do several of the areas in the Appalachians with the highest historical encounter density. This may be coincidence, or it may be a feature of whatever relationship exists between certain kinds of geological environments and the phenomena reported within them. The research required to determine which is not currently being conducted by any mainstream institution. But the pattern is there, and patterns in evidence are always worth following, regardless of where they lead. Before this episode closes, it is worth acknowledging something that the analytical tradition around the Patterson-Gimlin film tends to avoid. The film is, among other things, a profound human document, not because it proves anything, not because it resolves anything, but because it represents a moment when an ordinary person, an ordinary financially struggling, physically courageous, somewhat reckless ordinary person, ran toward something that most people would have run away from and pointed a camera at it and kept filming. Patterson was not a scientist. He was not wealthy. He did not have institutional backing or professional protection. He had a rented camera and a belief that something real was out there, and a willingness to keep going back until he found it. And then he found it, and what he found has outlasted him, has outlasted the debates he could not win in his lifetime, has outlasted the dismissals and the mockery and the decades of official indifference. It is still there in that film, still walking, still turning to look at the camera with that quality of awareness that has troubled researchers for half a century. Roger Patterson died in 1972, not knowing whether anyone would ever believe him. 57 years later, nobody has proven him wrong. That is not justice exactly. The world is not organized around justice, but it is something. The film is 59 seconds long. It has been examined for 57 years. The questions it raised on October 20th, 1967 are the same questions we are asking tonight. And somewhere in the Six Rivers National Forest, in the drainage that runs below the ridge, where the trees are oldest and the shadows are deepest, something that does not need anyone to believe in it continues to be exactly what it has always been: present, patient, and entirely indifferent to the debate. There are things about the Patterson-Gimlin film that the debate has never adequately addressed, things that sit in the record quietly and that deserve more attention than they have received. One of them is the response of the horses. Both horses reacted before Patterson and Gimlin could see anything. The creek bed came into view around a bend, and the horses were already in distress before the figure was visible. This is documented in both Patterson's and Gimlin's accounts, given independently and consistently over decades. Horses are extraordinarily sensitive to the presence of large predators. They have evolved over millions of years to detect the presence of animals that can kill them with more sensitivity and at greater range than most human observers. The response that Patterson and Gimlin described, sudden, full body, both animals simultaneously, is not the response of horses that have detected a human being in a costume walking along a creek bed. It is the response of prey animals that have detected something they recognize at a deep biological level as genuinely threatening. This is evidence, not conclusive, but real. The horses reacted to something that their nervous systems classified as a large, dangerous animal. The horses did not know they were supposed to react to a man in a suit as if it were an unknown predator. They reacted to what was actually there. And then there is the matter of what happened to Bob Gimlin's horse. Gimlin's horse, unlike Patterson's, did not throw him. He controlled it. He was an experienced horseman and he kept his seat. But he has described in interviews what it cost him to keep control. The animal was in a state of extreme distress that went beyond ordinary fear responses. It was, Gimlin said, in a state he had never seen in a horse before, something beyond the normal spectrum of equine fear. He has said that what the horse seemed to be expressing was not the fear of a specific threat. It was something more fundamental, a response to a category of thing rather than a specific thing, as if whatever was in that creek bed registered to the horse not as a large predator to be fled, but as something outside the entire framework of known dangers, something that the horse's nervous system did not have a category for. That description from a man who spent his life around horses and who had every reason to downplay the anomalous nature of the encounter is significant. The horses knew what was there before the men did, and what they knew was beyond their experience. 60 years ago, the Pacific Northwest was a different place. The old-growth forests were more intact, the roads less extensive. The places where a large animal could live without regular human contact were larger and more numerous. Today, those forests are more fragmented. The roads have reached further. The wilderness areas that remain are smaller and more visited. The buffer between human civilization and the deep forest has been reduced in ways that should, by any biological logic, make large, unknown animals harder to sustain and easier to find. And yet, the encounter reports continue. They have not declined with the forest. They have not decreased as the wilderness has contracted. If anything, the geographic distribution of reports has shifted as human settlement has shifted, not disappearing from developed areas, but pulling back into the remaining wildland, concentrating in the places where the old growth still stands and the roads still end. Whatever this is, it has adapted. Or whatever this is does not require the conditions that a biological animal would require to survive. The indigenous traditions would not phrase it as either of these options. They would say, it was here before the forest. It will be here after the forest. The forest is where it chooses to be, not where it is constrained to be. This understanding that the being's relationship to physical habitat is a choice rather than a biological requirement sounds like mysticism in the Western framework, but it is consistent with the evidence. More consistent in certain respects than the strictly biological explanation. The film that Patterson shot in 1967 is 59 seconds of something walking through a forest. What walks through that forest tonight is the same something, or its kind, or whatever category of being it belongs to that persists across seasons and decades and centuries, while the debates about what it is continue on the other side of the tree line. The debates have a beginning and an end. The forest does not. Whatever walks in it tonight has been walking in it since before anyone thought to ask what it was. It will be walking in it long after the question is forgotten, or answered, or simply carried, as the traditions carry it, not resolved, not abandoned, but held, with attention, with respect, with the patience of people who understand that some things reveal themselves only to those who have learned to wait. The film runs for 59 seconds. The forest has been running for 10,000 years. Somewhere in those years, in the quiet between the questions, is everything we need to understand. We have not been quiet long enough to hear it. Not yet. There is one analyst whose work on the Patterson-Gimlin film stands apart from the others, not because his conclusions are more dramatic, but because his methodology is more honest about its own limitations. His name is M.K. Davis. He spent years performing frame-by-frame stabilization and enhancement of the original footage using digital tools that were not available to earlier analysts. His work is meticulous. His documentation is detailed. His conclusions are careful. What Davis found in the enhanced footage is a level of physical detail that earlier analyses could not access. Muscle movement, skin texture, the way light moves across the surface of the figure during the stride cycle. He found things that are consistent with a biological animal. The skin appears to move independently of the underlying structure in ways that synthetic materials do not move. The muscle groups visible in the back and legs show the kind of sequential activation that real muscle produces during locomotion, a wave of contraction that moves through the tissue in a pattern that is difficult to reproduce with foam or fiber. He also found things he could not explain, details in certain frames that he has declined to speculate about publicly, saying only that they require more analysis before conclusions are appropriate. This is the honest answer, ultimately, to the question of what the Patterson-Gimlin film shows. It requires more analysis. It has always required more analysis. It will continue to require more analysis because the available analytical tools keep improving and the film keeps yielding new details to each new generation of technology. What it never yields is resolution, and the question of whether resolution is possible, whether the film is the kind of evidence that can produce resolution, or whether it is something else, a record of something that does not resolve because it does not operate by the rules that resolution requires, is the question that the next 57 years will probably fail to answer, just as the last 57 have. The figure is still walking in that film. It is still turning to look at the camera. It is still walking into the trees. And in the forest beyond the trees, in the country that the camera could not follow it into, whatever it was is still doing whatever it does in the places where the roads end and the old growth begins, and the silence is the kind of silence that means something other than nothing. We filmed 59 seconds of it in 1967. The rest of it has been going on for considerably longer than that. And it is going on tonight. Right now, in a forest you could name, if you knew which ones to name, and perhaps even in one you have walked through without knowing what else was walking there. That is the thing about this subject that stays with you once you have spent enough time with it. Not the famous film, not the famous tracks, not the famous incidents in the famous locations. The thing that stays with you is the possibility, the genuine, evidence-supported, tradition-confirmed possibility that the forest you walked through last summer, the trail you know well, the campsite you have returned to for years, has not been as empty as it felt, that something in it has known you were there, has watched you come and go, and has made each time the same decision the figure at Bluff Creek made in October of 1967, to let you pass without revealing itself, for reasons that remain its own. The creek at Bluff Creek is still running tonight. The water moves over the same rocks it moved over on October 20th, 1967. The same ridgelines rise above it. The same old growth stands in the places where the logging has not yet reached. The same quality of light falls through the canopy in the afternoon. The same shadows pool in the drainage at dusk. The same silence settles over the forest when something large moves through it. Nothing has changed in the country itself, only our understanding of what inhabits it. Or rather, our inability, after 57 years, to arrive at any understanding that fully accounts for what was filmed there, what has been reported there, what the people who have spent the most time in that country have experienced there and then, mostly chosen not to tell anyone about. The film is the most famous piece of evidence in a subject full of evidence that mainstream science does not know what to do with. It is famous not because it is the best evidence, but because it is the most visible, the most accessible, the thing you can watch. But watching it is not the same as understanding it. And understanding it is not the same as understanding what produced it. The figure turned and looked at the camera. In that look, if you watch the film carefully and allow yourself to sit with what you are seeing, rather than immediately reaching for the explanation that resolves your discomfort, there is something that resists the simple categories. It is not the look of an animal that has been startled. It is not the look of a person in a costume who has been told where to look and when. It is not the look of something performing for an audience. It is the look of something that is doing exactly what it intended to do, that was aware of the camera before the camera was pointed at it, that allowed the filming to happen for exactly as long as it chose to allow it, and then walked into the trees, and has not definitively been seen since. 59 seconds, 57 years. The forest is the same, the questions are the same, and whatever turned to look at that camera is out there tonight, in some drainage, on some ridge, at the edge of some tree line where the light is going and the shadows are growing long, aware of being wondered about, and choosing, as it has always chosen, exactly how much to reveal.